chapter 9, verses 2 to 13. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, is it good for us to be here? Let us put up these 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." He didn't know what to say because he was so frightened. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud. "This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had arisen from the dead. They kept this matter to themselves, discussing what rising from the dead meant. And they asked him, "Why did the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first?" And Jesus replied, "To be sure, Elijah comes first and restores all things. Why then is it written that the Son of Man must suffer and be rejected? But I tell you, Elijah has come, and they have done to him everything they wished, just as it is written about him." Let's pray as we begin this morning. Lord God, we thank you for who you are. Thank you for your Son. Thank you for the hope that we have through Jesus. Lord, thank you for the power, the glory that you have, and yet we can become a part of that, only by your grace. So Lord, as we look at this passage and think about who Jesus is, would you just be with us? Allow us to listen. Allow us to learn. And Lord, give me strength as I share. Allow me to speak with clarity and with compassion and passion for who you are. In your name. Amen. Do you all hear me? Is the microphone working? That's all good. So this morning, we're looking at a passage which answers a really important question. Who is Jesus? For centuries, people have asked the same question. Generations after generations have read this book, the Bible. They've learned from others, they've heard the gospel of Jesus and who he was. And they still ask the question, who is Jesus? And we still ask that question today. Even those who met Jesus personally asked this question, who is Jesus? And this was a hot topic for the disciples who followed him around in his ministry. They watched him perform miracles and show his love, his character to people. And this was the question on everyone's lips. And if you remember a few weeks ago, David was preaching on Mark chapter 8. And at the end of chapter 8, it tells us that people asked the disciples who Jesus was. And they replied saying, well, some say he's John the Baptist, others say he's Elijah, and still others call him another prophet. And then in verse 29 of chapter 8, even the disciples asked the question, who is Jesus? And this is the turning point where Peter actually sees that Jesus is Christ. He sees that Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God. So really, people were unsure who Jesus was. Perhaps they doubted him. They thought he was a nice guy, a good teacher, a really good magician like Dynamo. People weren't sure who Jesus was. But this passage is called the Transfiguration because God wanted to answer this question once and for all. Who is Jesus? It's an event which was witnessed by James and John and Peter, and it revealed the power of God. And it showed Jesus in his true glory, his true self. This passage answers the question who Jesus is because God strips away the veil and the disciples see clearly who Jesus is. Jesus in his full glory, and who Jesus still is today, the Son of God, filled with power and grace for our lives. So who is Jesus? Well, Jesus is the one and only Son of God, the Messiah. Jesus rose in dazzling white clothes, his face was brighter than the sun, and God's booming voice from the clouds appeared to the disciples and said, "This is my Son, you should listen to him." And then Elijah and Moses appear to them too. Moses is the lawgiver, the man who led the Israelites from captivity, "Let my people go," or as Rugrats said, "Let my babies go," if you've ever watched the Rugrats version of it. And then there's also Elijah, he was the great prophet. And these two people were the great ones of the Old Testament, who many of the Jews would have followed, and they would have believed were equally or even more important than who Jesus is. But it's not Moses or Elijah who transfigures in this story. They're not dazzling white because only Jesus shines. Only Jesus is the disciples' source of light. And when Peter and the others saw Jesus change, they thought it was absolutely terrifying. And the passage says that Peter doesn't know what to say, and they were frightened at what they saw. It's interesting when we read stories about Jesus, how many times the disciples were frightened about what Jesus was about to do or what Jesus was doing. When Jesus walks on water, the disciples are frightened. When he calms the storm, the disciples are frightened. And even after they meet him, after the resurrection, the disciples were frightened. But wouldn't you be a bit frightened too, if you were the disciples? After all, this is the creator of the universe, the God who is bigger than space and time, the God of complete love and holiness. A God that is beyond our understanding. So a bit of fear that the disciples had would be a bit understandable, I would think. And I think this is why Paul says that we're to work out our salvation with fear and trembling, because there's no way to put God in a box. There's no way to explain logically who God is, and we're only kidding ourselves if we think we know all the answers to who and how powerful God really is. But we're privileged because we can have a real relationship, a real friendship with this mysterious and unexplainable God. This God full of power. But anyway, Peter panics, he fumbles his words, he suggests that they build shelters for the three of them and stay up on the mountain. And he calls out to Jesus and he says, "Rabbi, is it good for us to be here?" And as I said before, just before this event, Peter confessed Jesus as the Son of the living God. But now suddenly, Jesus is Rabbi again, just a teacher despite all that they were seeing. Perhaps Peter was a bit confused about what he meant when he said Jesus is the Messiah. Maybe he was just frightened. But he struggled to get to grips with who Jesus was, his true identity. He didn't properly understand who Jesus was. But it says in the passage, he really didn't know what to say. And this shows how confused he was. He suggests making some tents to prolong the experience and to stay on the mountain. But God is clear and he says, "This is my Son, who I love, listen to him." Which means that they were to follow Jesus and not the law or the prophets of Moses and Elijah. Because when Jesus came to earth, the law, the prophets, they served their turn, they passed away. But only Jesus is the fulfillment of both these things, both the law and the prophets. Only Jesus alone remains, and that's why Elijah and Moses disappeared. Jesus' death brings something called a new covenant. And this covenant is based on one thing, and that's God's grace. Ephesians 2:8 says, "For by grace we have been saved, nothing we've done or can do, but it is by Jesus' death, which was to come shortly after this, that we will be saved." It's nothing we can do, but only what Jesus has done in our lives. So who is Jesus? Well, he's the Messiah. He's God's only Son. He's the fulfillment of the Old Testament. And Jesus is the only way to salvation through grace. And who else is Jesus? Well, Jesus is the Saviour. And it's interesting that Jesus tells Peter, James and John that they're not to tell anyone about the transfiguration until after the resurrection. And after God spoke to confirm, to tell them that Jesus was the Son of God, the clouds lifted and only Jesus remained. And once again, Jesus became humble. His power hidden, his glory hidden. And he stood beside his disciples. He says, "Tell no one what you have seen until the Son of Man has been risen from the dead." And you can imagine how difficult this would have been for the disciples. They've just seen Elijah and Moses and Jesus rise up on this mountain, and they've heard God's booming voice from the mountaintop, and they weren't allowed to tell anybody. They wanted to stay up there for longer, but they couldn't. They couldn't stay up there for forever, because it was necessary for them to come back to the ordinary world, the ordinary responsibility of life. After all, that's who Jesus has come to serve. And this tells us a little bit about discipleship as well. Discipleship is following Jesus and dying to ourselves. But we live in the ordinary world. We can't selfishly stay up on the mountaintop. We can't just bask in seeing God's glory from there. But the real challenge of being a disciple of Jesus is following him and giving up ourselves when we're part of the realities of the world. But I wonder, why did he do that? Why did he say that they weren't allowed to say anything? See, people, when Jesus lived his life, they saw him in different ways. Some saw him as a miracle maker. Some saw him as a really sketchy magician with a really good trick up his sleeve. Some saw him as a good moral teacher. Some just saw him as another prophet. And some of the religious leaders saw him as this wonder-working Messiah who did everything that they had planned and everything that they hoped for. The problem is that if they had told everyone of this amazing encounter with Moses and Elijah, it would only convince people more he was this miracle worker. And they wouldn't have seen actually what Jesus' mission was. And that was to die for the sins of others. And after all, we saw that Peter didn't quite understand what Jesus' mission fully was yet. And so to allow people to see fully what Jesus was going to do on the cross, he commanded them not to tell anybody. So after this transfiguration, Jesus climbs down from the mountain and he tells them that he's going to suffer and die and be raised from the dead. When Jesus came to earth, he didn't come down to earth to be a people pleaser, just to be a nice guy, but he came to teach people about who God was. And Jesus was God. He had full power. He had God's power, but he put this aside. He put his own glory aside so that he can give his life for many. He gave up his life and died on the cross. And this was necessary. This was Jesus' mission. But the disciples were confused about what he meant. What do you mean, raising from the dead? What does he mean that the Son of Man must suffer and be rejected? After all, look at the power that he has in the transfiguration. Look at the glory that he has. How can Jesus have so much power, yet the Son of Man must suffer and be rejected? But they would come to know fully what Jesus meant by his words. They would find out that Jesus would come to earth so that he might die for the sin of man, but be raised on the third day to new life, defeating sin, defeating death, and making a way for us to have a relationship with him. Shortly after Jesus comes down from the mountaintop with the disciples, he would be arrested. He would lay down his life willingly as a sacrifice for us. Jesus said, "Tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man had been risen from the dead." And this is when we would see Jesus' true power complete. The disciples will go from seeing this glimpse of holiness, this glory and the power that Jesus had as God, the power that only God has, to dying on a cross. And on the cross, people gathered and they mocked him. The scribes and the Pharisees would torment him. They said, "If you're really the Son of God, then bring yourself down from that cross." And Jesus had the power to do that when they said that, when they mocked him, when they laughed in his face. Jesus had the same transfigured power that the disciples saw before. But he remained on the cross, and he died on that cross. He even shouted, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." He forgave those who persecuted him. And if Jesus was not fully God and fully man, he couldn't have taken the punishment on the cross. For it's because Jesus is God, he had the power to be risen, just as he told Peter, James, and John. Jesus showed them his glory, who he was, but instead, as Philippians 2:7-8 says, he made himself nothing, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even on the cross. The disciples didn't know what was going to happen. They had no clue what Jesus meant, but they would come to understand who Jesus was. He was God who had come to earth in human flesh, that he might die for the sins of all. But he would be raised on the third day to new life, defeating fear, defeating death, defeating sin, so we could have a relationship with Jesus through his love for us. As we move to Easter in a couple of weeks' time, we just think how truly powerful Jesus is. Yet people mocked him on a cross. He had this power, and yet he died on the cross for us. Jesus had this great glory and power, yet his mission was to come and die for us. So I asked the same question this morning to you. Who is Jesus? Is he the Son of God that's come to save you? Jesus is the only person who can do that. It's not Moses or Elijah or any other religious leader or any other good guy. It's Jesus. Not even ourselves can save us. It's Jesus. By his grace, we have been saved. Through his death, and then through his amazing and miraculous resurrection. And if Jesus is the only one who can save you, have you let him become Lord in your life? Or maybe this morning we know who Jesus is. You're on that challenging and an amazing journey, which is being a disciple of Jesus. But being a disciple means that we follow Jesus in our lives. We take up our cross, we deny ourselves, we grow in the presence of God, but we have to do that in the ordinary of life. We can't always live in the moment of seeing God's glory right in front of us. Just a bit like how Peter wanted to. How wonderful it would be to stay on the mountain forever with God's glory, but we're to live our lives in the world. We're to be a part of the world, but we're not of the world. We're to follow God's ways until we meet Jesus, transfigured again in his full glory, when we meet him face to face. That's when we'll see the true power of this transfiguration. But it's only Jesus. It's only Jesus' glory. It's only Jesus' kingdom. It's only his power which can save us and lead us into a life filled with his presence. And I ask you, in any situation that you're in, who is Jesus in that situation? Maybe it's a situation of pure joy, pure happiness. Maybe it's not. Maybe there's some challenges going on. Maybe there's some things you're angry with God about. But who is Jesus in that situation? And what does Jesus' power and his grace and the cross mean in that situation? Let's pray together. Father, thank you that it's only by your grace we are saved. Lord, thank you, it's nothing that we've done, nothing we can ever do. But it's only by you and the love that you had for us, the love for your Son as he came to earth, to live a life to challenge people, to free people from their sin, the chains that brought them down. And you released them. You released them through the death on the cross. And Lord, thank you that we can be free. Free from death, free from the fear that we once had, because we know you. And we know your power. We know who you are. And Lord, in any situation, in any trial, in the moments of joy that we might have at the moment, I pray that we would take a moment to remember who you are in that place. And Lord, we give you thanks that you don't keep your glory to yourself, but actually you share it with us freely, so we could know you and have a relationship with you. So we just thank you for that. We thank you for all you do in our lives. And Lord, as we continue to grow as a fellowship, as a church, as individual people, would you bless us? Fill us with your Spirit and send us off to be disciples and to show who you are in the presence of the ordinary life, in the everyday tasks of life. In your name.